introducing his guests from out of his hat. I see there Mr. Powell.
Yes, well, I've got with me one of the leading no men, Mr. Enoch Powell, who is smiling as if he was one of the victors, and Mr. Jim Pryor, who's got his usual cheerful but phlegmatic countenance. Mr. Powell, there wasn't much point in asking people, advising people to vote Labour from the point of view of staying in or coming out of the common market, was there?
I'm always in favour of a question being reopened as important as this. It has been reopened, and now we have a provisional result which takes us on to the next stage.
Why do you say a provisional result, and what is the next stage?
Oh, I'm just relying on the government's official statement.
Can I read it for you?
Yes, our continued
membership will depend on the continuing assent of Parliament.
That's the one.
Yes.
And since Parliament will be continuously re-elected by the electorate, then this is an ongoing debate.
Yes, but you, with respect, Mr. Powell, you have picked out one sentence from a passage which deals with the constitutional position.
That's right.
And not with the practical position, because are you suggesting that from now on you and others who feel like you should continue a parliamentary struggle to get Britain out?
But of course, this is like September 1938. In October 1938, I'm sure that the vast majority of Neville Chamberlain had gone to the country. He would have swept the country for an act of abnegation. But the very same people, within 12 months, when they saw behind the facade, when they penetrated to the realities, stood up to fight for the continued existence of our nation. And that's what will happen.
But you're saying that this is a kind of Munich?
Yes, I am.
I see. And
you seem surprised.
And when do you see our 1940 coming, when we're going to stand alone?
Well, let's have 1939 first, when we decide that we have to fight. You see, I simply do not believe, although, and I make no complaint of the pro-marketeers, particularly people like Edward Heath and Peter Kirk, they've been beyond criticism in that they have made it perfectly clear that to remain part of the common market is to renounce national status for Britain. They say the nation state is obsolete and we are to recognise it.
Who are you going to get to support you in your continuing parliamentary struggle to get Britain out of the common market, Mr. Powell?
Well, as the House of Commons, week by week, has to debate the consequences of being in the common market, it will, as it tends to do, filter through to wider and wider areas that they were rightly told by people like Edward Heath that this did in fact mean that they would become a province in a new state. Well, now, I do not believe that when that is realised, that it will be assented to.
I'll come to Mr. Whitelaw, who's down at the Waldorf Hotel listening to us in just a moment. But
well,
may I put one point,
Mr. Whitelaw,
may I put one point to you, Mr. Powell, that I remember you 2 or 3 years ago, when you were still in the Conservative Party, at the party conference in Brighton, predicting with total conviction and certainty that this country would not go into the common market. May I suggest to you that your prediction now is no more right than that one was?
You have two events, if I may say so, slightly confused. One was the Conservative Party conference where I said that I would never assent to the act of abnegation involved in Britain joining the common market. And a meeting in East Ham in September 1971 when I said it will not happen. I am still convinced that it will not happen. I am still convinced that the people of this country cannot be absorbed into a European state.
May I just point out that Wiltshire has said yes and Oxfordshire has said yes, and could I point out to Mr. Powell that he did say, as he has confirmed, that we will not go into the common market, and we did go into the common market. And are you not just as wrong now as you were then?
No, sir. The British people do not mean it because they still have not been able to credit the implications of being in the common market. They still think they will be a nation. They still think they will govern and tax and legislate for themselves. They are mistaken. It's not the fault of many of the pro-marketeers that they are mistaken, but it is a thing so incredible to them that I'm not inclined to blame them overmuch. But they will learn.
Mr. Whitelaw, have you been listening to us?
Yes, I have.
Well, now, what do you say to that? A parliamentary struggle led or perhaps solely carried on by Mr. Powell to get Britain out of the common market on the basis of this clear and unequivocal statement in the government pamphlet that our membership will depend on the continuing assent of Parliament.
Well, Enoch Powell, of course, is entitled, as always, to say what he intends to do. And I don't dispute what he will do, because I'm sure that is exactly the line he will take. What I would hope is that now that the British people have voted, or looked like voting anyway, overwhelmingly for staying in the European Economic Community, we can put all the uncertainty of the past behind us. And we can now go forward as constructive partners in that community, sharing with our partners exactly how that community should develop in the future to the benefit of all its peoples.
Do you think, Mr. Whitelaw, that this common market campaign has perhaps had some effect in reopening the question of how the Conservative Party should be led? Because many people are remarking on the tremendous personal resurgence and revival of popularity of Mr. Heath. May I point out that Durham has said yes, and come back to the point that people are saying Mr. Heath is making a tremendous political comeback, and who can know what will happen?
Well, of course, the first thing I think one ought to say is that the Conservative Party as a whole has overwhelmingly supported Britain staying in the European Economic Community. Indeed, an enormous part of the result and what has been achieved is due to those people who normally support the Conservative Party.
So you're
I
saying
am delighted. I am delighted about that. I think it's very important indeed. Margaret Thatcher made it perfectly clear that's what she wanted our party to do. That is what our party has done. Certainly, Ted Heath has had an enormous success in this campaign. He is the person who, as Prime Minister, took us into Europe. I was proud to be one of his cabinet ministers at that time. He did it, and he has shown to the country the great conviction he had behind doing it.
So you're saying,
that is an enormous achievement.
So you're saying, Mr. Whitelaw, that the chairman of the Conservative Backbenchers Committee, Mr. Edward Buchan, was talking tripe the other night?
Mr. Buchan must talk for himself.
Was he talking sense, in your view?
No.
Do you think he can remain as chairman of the Conservative Backbenchers Committee when he makes such a remark at such a critical moment?
That is entirely up to the 1922 Committee, of whom, of course, I must remind you that I am not in any sense a voting member. I am allowed, as the deputy leader of the party, to attend the 22 Committee. I am not entitled to vote. What they do, who they have as their chairman, is entirely a matter for them.
Do you think that Mr. Wilson can claim this referendum result? You're a fair-minded man, Mr. Whitelaw, and that's why I ask you this question, as a personal political triumph?
I would have thought that he would have realized it was very unwise ever to have gone on the course of a referendum at all, with all the uncertainties it has inevitably created. However, having done it, he has certainly achieved, it looks like, a very important endorsement of the policy which he was following. I'm bound to say that that was due in very large measure to the report that he received, as I see it, in the national interest from the Conservative Party. I think that is, in fact, very important. But I don't seek to deny anyone the credit for the position. If one believes that something is in the best interests of one's country in the long run, and I believe that Britain staying in Europe is enormously in the best interests of this country, if one believes that, irrespective of any personalities, one fights one's hardest for that. And perhaps I might say to Enoch Powell, on the other hand, if one believes the opposite, one fights with whoever one has with one exactly in the same direction. I quite understand that, but I believe in doing what I think is right for my country, and that is what I must say I have tried to do during this campaign.
Mr. Pryor, do you think that the... I brought Mr. Whitelaw in because he came up after you come into the studio, and we wanted to have a talk with him. But could I ask you whether you think that the anti-market cabinet ministers should now resign on the grounds that they cannot possibly, as some people would think, cannot possibly wholeheartedly carry out the job of taking this country into its full European partnership?
Well, I think broadly, yes. I don't see how Mr. Benn can possibly continue as a member of a cabinet, having said what he has said in the last few weeks about membership of the community. If he believes, as apparently he does, that between 500,000 and 750,000 jobs have been lost as a result of British membership, I don't see how he can remain a member of a government which is cooperating within Europe.
On that particular constitutional political point, Mr. Powell. Would you agree with that?
I thought it was an interesting view coming from a member of a government of which not one individual resigned, although they reversed the principal policies on which they were elected in 1970. But no one, I think, should propose to tell another politician when he should resign. And after all, the Labour government, the Labour Party, did say that as a government they would accept the outcome, whatever that might be and however interpreted, of the referendum. Nevertheless, I think it is very difficult for an individual who deeply feels that the nature of the abnegation, the destruction of our British democracy involved in being in the common market, to work with it as a member of a government. But that's personal, and one has no right to dictate to other people's consciences.
Can I ask you one more question, Mr. Powell? You asked people to vote Labour in last February on the grounds that they would at least have a choice about remaining in the community. And now that they've had this choice, and now that they've given their verdict, what is the point of having asked for that they have this choice if now that they've had it, you say you're not going to accept it?
Well, I'm sorry that their verdict is their provisional verdict, provisional as we both agree in a constitutional sense, is so far what it is. But I certainly can't regret that the question was not suppressed and regarded as a totally closed one, as it would have been if a Conservative majority had been returned in February 1974.
Well, I think Mr. Powell has done a great deal of damage, both to the British cause of trying to remain in Europe and keep in Europe and get on with the job. And, of course, I think he's done a great deal of damage as well to trying to get Europe understand that Britain wanted to remain. I mean, if Mr. Powell had not made his speech about I think we would have had a Conservative government today, and I think we would have controlled inflation a lot better than we've been able to control it.
Of course, Mr. Powell's view would be that this would be a Conservative government which was treacherous to its principles announced at the previous election.
No, but not.
I think that's a different point.
I don't think that's the same point at all. But what I do think is the point, and that is that Mr. Powell told people to vote Labour in order to try and keep us out of the common market. And he failed to do, by voting Labour, they have failed to keep us out of the common market. It has been shown abundantly now by all the returns we've had, and I think returns will go on that way, that the British want to remain a member of the community and see their future within the community. I think it's time that Mr. Powell shut up for a bit.
What about that,
well,
Enoch?
what is important is that the rest of the common market should recognise the constitutional fact about this country, that unlike countries with a written constitution, our continued membership, I again quote, and these actual words were in the Conservative White Paper of 1971, our continued membership will depend on the continuing assent of Parliament. There can be no final decision by the British people to renounce their sovereignty.
But then you mustn't argue
Well,
that...
I've got to go, if you don't mind, Jim, because we've got a number of results in Salop and one in Yorkshire.